What's good, everybody? I'm Jędrek, and in this video I want to introduce you to Familiars, which is a combo-ish control Pauper deck that I've been playing over the last few months with a decent amount of success, both local and online. And I want to go over the basic construction of the deck, as well as different versions of it, mostly focusing on what I like to call vanilla farms, which is what I would consider a stock version and the version that I prefer right now. And I'm not gonna delve too deep into stuff like matchups or gameplay or all the different difficulties of playing this deck online, which are many. Because I want this video to be somewhat short, probably around half an hour, but I know that I tend to get pretty rambly sometimes, so it might be a bit longer than that. But if you like this video and you would like me to cover other topics than just like the deck building and overall structure of the deck, then feel free to respond in the comments or reach me on Discord or anywhere else you can find me online. And I'd be more than happy to cover gameplay and like the online aspect of playing Familiars once again, which is quite troublesome in my opinion. And of course, you can check our website, mysticalteachings.com, that me and Sodek are running. There will be a sideboard guide for Familiars on this website. Or there is now probably, now being the moment in time you are watching this video, because they will release basically at the same time. So if you want to get some more knowledge from me after watching this video, if you like it, then feel free to go to Mystical Teachings. And if you subscribe, you'll get a fairly detailed sideboard guide by yours truly. Okay, without any further ado, let's get into a short introduction. As I've said, there are multiple versions of Familiar as a deck, and they all play out somewhat differently, but what they all have in common is that they can be described as a control deck primarily, in my opinion, with some combo and prison elements, especially when it comes to closing out the game. Because for the majority of any given game of Magic, your goal will be to stabilize your situation on the battlefield, and once you do that, you want to snowball past the point of no return, and so your opponent can't do anything, and they are virtually and sometimes literally 0% to win the game. And after achieving this goal, winning is usually trivial, aside from time constraints, which can be somewhat problematic, especially if you are newer to the deck. This stabilizing and entering the snowball phase can sometimes, or even winning as well, can sometimes all happen in a span of single turn. If you just like randomly draw into your combo mid-turn, or if your stabilization is getting infinite life and thus effectively winning the game against a deck that can't beat infinite life. Sometimes it will be more like meticulous and planned over multiple turns with some Archaeomancer loops and getting to first delaying opponent's threats and then finally answering it and turning the corner. But still, those are like details of this whole game plan, which once again is to stabilize and then turn the corner, as control decks usually do in various formats. The namesake card of the deck, which is Sunscape Familiar, allows you to be much more efficient when it comes to mana, because even for Pauper standard, or for what people that plays Pauper like, if you are a person who played Pauper like 10 years ago, you are probably accustomed to Pauper being this very slow format with a lot of clunky spells. But over the last few years, Pauper sped up considerably, and Familiars kinda didn't, because you are still playing a lot of 3, 4, and 5 drops, and your way of getting back or catching up with the format in terms of tempo is to use Sunscape Familiar Discount to make all your blue and green. We're not gonna focus on green spells because most versions of Familiars don't run any green cards. And making your blue spells, which is like probably 80-90% of your spells, cheaper, makes it much easier for you to not fall behind on tempo, and it effectively generates tons of mana each turn, especially in the late game. It's not uncommon to cast like 3 or 4 spells with the discount, or even infinite, because Familiar is what allows you to get infinite loops with this deck. And in many different formats, cost reducers have always been potent, and Sunscape Familiar is no different from them. And the main way of generating card advantage and making use of all that extra mana is to use creatures with ETB effects combined with Ephemerate and Ghostly Flicker. Now let's go into strengths of Familiars. I think that for any good control deck, it needs to have inevitability in the late game over most archetypes in the format, because if you are not winning majority of your late games, then why do you even bother being a control deck? And I think Familiars does it very, very well in Pauper. There are truly very few decks that have inevitability over Familiars, and I can't think of any off the top of my head. Maybe some Storm deck, like probably Ruby Storm, and to some extent Burn, are decks that if you don't win the game, or in case of Familiars, get infinite life before they get too much resources, they will overwhelm you. But your plan goes over the top of their plan. They can't beat your end game, which is gaining infinite life. And I guess some decks can try to deck you, which might be possible sometimes. But overall, I think Familiars have one of the most inevitable late games in the format, which is a crucial and necessary thing for the deck to exist in its current form. Next up, it's a great deck against archetypes that struggle with beating the card Snap. Snap is a crucial part of your mana engine as well that I will cover later. But if it's also a very good interaction against the deck you're facing, then there is a good chance it's a good matchup for Familiars. Next, thanks to God Pharaoh's Faithful, it's a pretty good deck against red decks, especially in game 1, because if you just play 1 or 2 0-4s that gain you life on every single spell, it might be, and probably will be, hard for your opponent to get you on tempo, especially if they are playing decks like Rally, rather than Burn. And even if they are playing Burn, I think Faithful is less important there in that matchup, but still, without Pyroblast, it might be hard for them to contain your engine. And if you gain like 10 or 20 extra life and hold a counter spell for their Gutter Snipe, they can't really beat you. So I would say that at least game 1, red decks are pretty good matchups. And red decks are very popular right now, as I'm recording this video in mid-February 2026. The deck can beat most type of interaction, but usually not all of them at once, which is obviously a two-sided coin, because it's also weak to, or it can be affected with by most type of interaction. But I think Familiars in this regard is quite similar to modern Underworld Breach decks. That, for those of you who didn't follow Modern at the time when Underworld Breach with Mox Opal was legal, it's a combo deck that used a lot of artifacts and graveyard as well, and was kind of a Storm deck. So, and it relied on some creatures to generate value. So it was obviously affected by discard and Countermagic, as any deck is basically. Creature removal was life against it, artifact hate, graveyard hate, storm hate. So basically you looked at your modern sideboard and there were like 10 or even all 15 cards that can be reasonably brought against Breach, but Breach could beat any of those sideboard cards. The problem came when they layered on top of one another, especially when they were backed by pressure. So because Familiars aren't really a combo deck, they're mostly a control deck at heart. It's hard to have like a dedicated hate card against control. And that's been true basically forever in Magic. You mostly beat control by the way you are building your deck. And your strategy can just naturally line up well against control. You are not having a single sideboard card that beat control mostly, even though some people believe that to be the case. But especially in Pauper, I don't think such cards exist. Finally, it's a pretty intricate deck, which, to have another modern comparison, can be compared to to Amulet Titan, in my opinion, to some extent. In that both of those decks are like a loopy engine-based decks that have some loops that might not be super intuitive to your opponent. Of course, Amulet loops are more intricate than Familiar's loop, but still, there are a lot of spots where your opponent can use their interaction and they can use it like in a wrong spot. Because, for example, during any given turn, you'll play multiple cards and they will have like 10 different windows in which they can cast their removal spell or their Countermagic. And if you present them with 10 different windows, there is a higher chance that they pick a wrong window than if they have like 1 or 2 windows or 3 windows, but all of those 3 windows are essentially the same window. That obviously has a downside as well of being like somewhat high floor deck, or like the entry level for this deck is quite high and the learning curve is steep, I think. But if you invest your time to get proficient with the deck, I think this mostly disappears. Obviously, still, Magic is a very hard game, and you still will find yourself in a spot when deck's difficulty is an issue, especially if you are like short on time, you're playing a long tournament, you are tired, you are in a high pressure situation. But overall, I think if you invest your time and become a familiar main, this intricacy mostly plays as your strength, not your weakness. Speaking of weaknesses, now let's go to those. I think the top two are connected and basically the same thing. First of all, the mana base is quite clunky. You are playing 2-color deck, but it's mostly a mono blue deck that has to splash white for its engine cards. And you really want to play some copies of Azorius Chancery for Snap, which I think might be the trap. And even though I'm playing 3 Chanceries, I think that there is a chance that playing 2 is correct, but most people are playing 4, of course. But even without the Chancery being like a clunky land, still 2-color mana bases in Pauper are not ideal. And especially this one that you once again need white mana, but ideally or your mana is blue past turn 5 or something. Or most of your mana is blue past turn 5. Like if you ever draw 2 planes or you draw like a planes and Mortuary Mire and your turn 5 you only have 3 blue, like that can be an issue fairly often. Connected to that is that the curve of the deck is fairly high compared to other Pauper decks. And I think that there might be a way of remedying that in deck building. And also your way of fighting that is playing Sunscape Familiar to make your spells cheaper. But for the most part, if your Familiar doesn't live or you don't draw Familiar, then you will have a meaningfully higher curve than your opponent, which can be a downside, especially post-board, when some people will have Pyroblast against you, which is a card that this deck can struggle against meaningfully. Once again, particularly when playing against fast decks, like Pyroblast out of Giant Wildfire and Pyroblast out of Mono Red Madness are 2 completely different things, if you're playing against Giant or Affinity or any of those slow mid-rangey black decks, you can outplay their interaction by like setting up your counter interaction like Hydroblast, or just playing in a way that they have to tap out, or forcing through their Pyroblast, because like if you have 2 or 3 Mulldrifters or other like dangerous cards, be it Murmuring Mystic or Archaeomancer or Lorien Revealed, you will finally eventually you will power through that Pyroblast out of Giant. But very often against fast red decks, if they Pyroblast your 4-drop on turn 4 or 5, you are dead, because you expend all your resources on that turn, and they only needed to have 1 mana open for their Pyroblast. So that can often be a problem. Next thing to talk about is closing out the games. That can be tedious. And once you get proficient enough with the deck and you get confident enough to communicate what you are doing clearly, which I think is a very important skill in tournament Magic in general, you will get better than that, and you will close games more efficiently. You will know when you can attack with your Mulldrifters and when it's better to hold them back to block. And you'll just get overall like the amount of prowess that is needed to execute the game plan quickly. Connected to that is playing the deck online, which is extremely bothersome. Even if you're a seasoned FAMS player, playing the deck online is very, very bothersome, and it costs a lot of time to do that. And even if you are really good at clicking on Modo, I think I'm quite good at playing Magic Online. I've been playing Magic Online for like 10 years, most days of my life. And I'm pretty good with like hand-eye coordination and clicking fast on Modo, and I still time out from time to time. And I've seen other players just playing one league with familiars and immediately giving the deck up online because it's impossible to win in time. So if you want to become a familiar player online, be sure to practice a lot, because it will be very hard to fill some games in time, basically. Then we have the second side of the everything is good, or you can beat any type of interaction, but most interaction types can be effective against you, that we've talked earlier in the strength section. So I'm not gonna repeat myself on the same things. And then one like specific weakness to the current metagame, which I believe that will be a weakness up until Tolarian Terror is banned, but I don't think that will happen, nor it should happen. Mono Blue Terror is a bad matchup for familiars, and you can mitigate that. I think my version mitigates that pretty well. Last time I've played on Poppergeddon, I went 3-0 against Mono Blue Terror, which obviously is very anecdotal, but also when I'm facing some of the top Terror players online in challenges and stuff, I tend to win a good deal of games. I don't think it's like super favored or anything. It's probably close to 50-50, maybe slightly worse. But with the current setup, I am pretty okay playing against Terror, especially if I'm facing like a less experienced player, because I think that this is a very skill-based matchup. And obviously, if they have 3 Terrors on turn 3, you can't do anything and you will lose no matter how good you are at Magic. But if the game doesn't end on turn 4 or 5, then I think there's a lot of play to this matchup, and you can outmaneuver your opponent in most situations if you have the right tools to do so. Speaking of tools, this is the list that I have been playing recently, and is roughly what I would play in the for the foreseeable future, unless you are facing any very specific metagames. But for the most part, this is once again what I like to call vanilla FAMS. And this version of the deck basically doesn't play any packages. What I mean by package is like a group of cards that you have to add together to make some sense. For example, Cryogen Relic with extra Ghostly Flicker is a package, because you won't randomly put one Cryogen Relic into your deck. you want 4 Cryogen Relic, and you want extra flickers to flick it and get extra value out of it. Or Modern Age with flashback spells. You won't have 1 Modern Age in your deck. You will have 4 and then some support for it. This deck doesn't have such cards. Of course, you are playing Fork Familiars, you are playing your Mulldrifters, your Snaps. But those are like core pieces of the deck, and without them, the deck won't exist. So this version is the most like bare bones version, in my opinion. You are playing your engine cards, you are playing cantrips and some interaction and basically nothing else. Like every card in this main deck is either a mana generation, a cantrip, an ETB creature, a flicker effect, or a win condition. Or once again, some very bare bone interaction in form of 4 counter spells, because you need some interaction to survive early game. As far as some details go, I think you can move the mountain into the sideboard and play an extra card in the main deck, because Mountain Game 1 is not a very good land, but also Familiars is a very mana hungry deck, so even a colorless land is pretty okay, I think, especially because the deck is mana hungry if you don't have Familiar, and if you don't have Familiar, then you are making pretty good use of colorless mana with like Mulldrifter and Archaeomancer and Lorien and stuff like that. And the other thing is I'm only playing 3 Chanceries, most people play 4. I would consider playing 2, even definitely before I would consider playing 4. I think the danger of, or the downside of drawing 2 copies of Chancery is super high in the early game, and it's a type of card I would like to see 1 every game, but it doesn't need to be very early on, and I'd rather see 0 than 2 most of the time. I'm gonna talk about a red splash a bit later on, so now let's move on to different versions of the deck that I'm not playing, and why I have some problems with it, I guess. I'm gonna talk about Meeting of Minds first, which is a card that I think is, because some people will refer to this version as a Meeting of Mind version, which of course is like a minuscule detail. I don't think this is a Meeting of Mind version. I think this is like a bare bones version that can play Meeting of Minds or can omit Meeting of Minds. Both versions are valid. I've played without Meeting for a couple of weeks, and I think it's okay as well, but ultimately I think Meeting of Minds just works a bit too well in this deck to cut it entirely, because it's such a good card to pick up with Archaeomancer, in various points of the game, and even with Sunscape Familiar alone, is a 2 mana card because you play Familiar, and then you convoke, so it's 2 mana to draw 2 cards on instant speed, which is a fairly good rate. It plays well, especially post-board with your counter spells, with your snaps, with your interaction. It can be cast for 0 mana super often, and just makes for nice mana efficient turns. Okay, so the first version that I don't like is the Modern Age plus Flashback Spells version that I already briefly mentioned. This version basically relies on Modern Age first 2 chapters, which is Draw and Discard, to bin Deep Analysis and Prismatic Strands and other cards that can be used from graveyard for value. My biggest gripe with this version of the deck is that I think Modern Age is not a playable card. It takes a bit too long for it to become a creature, and playing to the board is very important with Familiars in my opinion, because of the high mana curve, and you want to recoup that tempo as soon as possible, and because Modern Age also plays badly with Ephemerate and other blink spells, because once again you need to wait 2 extra turns to make a creature out of it. I think Deep Analysis has some merit in Pauper in general, in Familiars, because it's a pretty good card against Countermagic, particularly Blasts, and I can see playing Deep Analysis in a regular Familiar deck in the sideboard probably for those red decks. Prismatic Strands is a card I don't really get. I've played a bit of Gates and I've played Strands, and at spots I was very impressed with the card, but overall I think it's just a band-aid rather than a permanent solution to things. And of course, in familiars, you want to buy a lot of time sometimes. But overall, I think this card is a bit too bad if you don't combine it with Modern Age to justify playing it. Then we have the Cryogen Relic version that I think is more interesting than the Meeting of Mind version in the fact that it's not that well explored. I think when I said earlier that I think familiars have a very high curve, but this issue can be mitigated, I was thinking about the Cryogen Relic version. I think there is a version of this deck maybe that exists that can be built with a lot of Cryogen Relic, a lot of Abjures, Hard Evidence, Jolted Awake, and you are building a deck that's more low to the ground than the current familiar decks, and that can compete on tempo with decks in Pauper, with like red decks and with elves and stuff. My biggest problem with this approach is that Cryogen Relic is a 2-mana spell that doesn't affect the board, which is definitely not tempo positive. And to some extent, playing like both Godfather's Faithful and Hard Evidence can mitigate that issue because you get to play a blocker on turn 1 very often, or more often than in a regular version. But still, I think that this version is probably worse than the stock one, but I'm much more inclined to try and experiment with this version of the deck than the Modern Age version. Finally, we have potential splashes. As you already saw, I like the red splash right now. I think Pyroblast is an amazing card, obviously against a mono blue deck, because why wouldn't it be an amazing card against mono blue deck? But I think the splash isn't that costly, and it gives you fighting chance against Terror, or the best fighting chance against Terror, making the matchup even, in my opinion, or close to. And there are just so many blue decks in Pauper, especially if we are playing mostly in paper, not online. I think some people will just gravitate toward blue decks. And if you go to a big event like Paupergeddon, for example, there will be a lot of players playing blue decks. They will play like Skred, Familiars, Terror, Fairies, blue-black of various kind, because they just enjoy this type of magic. And Pyroblast is just a very broad card in terms of any blue deck is probably at least a bit weak to Pyroblast, and against most of blue decks, Pyroblast is just amazing. So I think it's totally worth it to splash it. Other red cards I would consider is Breath Weapon that's already in my sideboard, especially against elves and fairies, and maybe something like Cast into Fire if you want cheaper removal option that can kill 2 things. The second potential splash is black. I know that back in the Glee heyday, everybody or some people were playing Esper Familiars because Snuff-Out could kill Basking Broodscale when they attempted to combo. I think the biggest plus of Snuff-Out is that it doesn't require you to have untapped black, so you can like fetch a tapped basic, or you can play your tapped dual land and still have immediate access to Snuff-Out rather than waiting a turn to cast your splash card. But also I think that the effect of Snuff-Out is so much worse than the effect of Pyroblast that even being this like extra head on tempo isn't worth it compared to how powerful Pyroblast is. Some other black cards that I would consider splashing are the Tithing Blade for Terror matchup, or some of the sweepers, either Arms of Hadar or Suffocating Fumes for Go White decks. And of course, Nihil Spellbomb, which I think is one of the best graveyard hate cards you can play in Pauper. And if we are playing black, then I would recommend playing some Nihil Spellbomb. Let's get into the deck construction itself, starting with mana generation, which I think is the most important part of the deck, because without it, you are just playing overcosted monsters that can be quite easily dealt with in most games. Sunscape Familiar and Snap are your main ways, and probably only ways, to generate extra mana. Snap in conjunction with both Familiar and Azorius Chancery can produce from 1 up to 3 extra mana. If you have Familiar and 2 Azorius Chancery, you can get 3 extra mana with Snap, which is obviously amazing, but even getting 1 or 2 extra mana with Snap is great. And because your deck is so full of ETB creatures, you often end up bouncing your own stuff rather than opposing creatures. But bouncing opposing creatures is also obviously quite common, especially early in the game when you have to get back on tempo. Familiar, there is not much to talk about. Just making your spells cheaper is excellent once again. And trying to protect your Familiar early on is quite important, but also with experience, you'll know in which matchups, in which situations you just have to jam it on turn 2 and hope you end up with it, because you can't afford to play it on turn 3 and protect it with Snap or something. But because even if you do that and you protect it with Snap, you're just so behind on tempo that you will lose the game anyways. Next up, we have card advantage, which is what I already talked about. The core package is Mulldrifter, Archaeomancer, and Flicker effects. There is some supporting cards. You can play Seagate Oracle, you can play Mob Lookout, you can play some other tertiary value monsters. But for the most part, this is how you generate card advantage repeatedly. Mulldrifter works very well with Ephemerate, because if you play it for the evoke cost, then you will have 2 triggers going on the stack. One is draw 2 cards, second is sacrifice Mulldrifter. You can stack them in a way that you first draw 2, then you sacrifice it. And you can respond to the sacrifice trigger with Ephemerate that you either drew from the draw 2 or you had in hand all this time. And you can keep it in play and draw 2 extra cards. And if you use Ephemerate rather than Flicker, you will maybe draw 2 extra cards in the next upkeep with Ephemerate. So that's a lot of card advantage. And I think Mulldrifter is the card that makes Familiars very good at mulliganing, because even if you mulligan to like 5 cards, you can very often win very easily. Or even if you don't win, you can redo your mulligan or undo your mulligan super easily with this deck, because it has so much card advantage. Archaeomancer is, I think, the most important value creature in the deck, and is the end game that I use most often to win my games, just looping Archaeomancer with Ephemerate and locking my opponent out of the game, but I will cover that later. Flicker is... You mostly play Flicker because it's an infinite combo. It creates all the infinite loops in the deck, that I will cover later, but it's worse than Ephemerate as a standalone blink effect. I think Ephemerate is insane. Most people are playing 2. I was playing 4 for a while. Now I settled on 3 copies, because once again, it's a card that sometimes you don't really want to see too early on into the game, but you want to see 1 most of the time in your first few turns, and you want to see 2 Ephemerates eventually to start looping things more effectively. So I like 3 copies. Rebound is a extremely strong mechanic for this card that I will also cover a bit more later on when I go to the loops and various endgames. Win conditions, those are basically cards that produce the effect that wins you the game, but winning the game is the effect of the result of just looping all your other stuff, and you just need some payoff for it. The most common ones are God Pharaoh's Faithful, that also just is a good tool at surviving early game with gaining few life every single turn. Murmuring Mystic is, on the other hand, a much more expensive card, but it's also one of the best standalone threats in Pauper. You just play Mystic and then you play some spells and you just stabilize the game all of the sudden. And it also generates infinite birds with your loops. Stonehorde Dignitary is not a card that people really play in the main deck, but I think it's a very important sideboard card for the archetype. And it can, with a very little setup, it can just stop your opponent from attacking ever again, which is very, very good in the matchups like Elves or Rally or Boggles or White Weenie or Heroic. All you need is Dignitary, Archaeomancer, and either Ephemerate or Ghostly Flicker to just make your opponent skip all their combats, and you don't need any extra setup. And when we get to loops, you will see how much setup most loops need. So compared to those loops, you'd only need 3 cards, which is not a lot. Next up, we have Countermagic, which is the only main deckable interaction other than Snap, in my opinion. There is some argument for playing main deck Frame and Charm, and I don't hate that idea. Currently, I don't have room for it in my deck, but you can consider playing it. Prohibit is the most versatile one, especially since it benefits from multiple familiars discount. But both Negate, especially Negate, and Remove Soul are also viable options. Most people play 2 Negates before they play a Remove Soul. I personally like having Remove Soul right now because there's a lot of creature decks and people playing stuff like Avenging Hunter, which is a very problematic card for familiars to beat if you don't have a good control over the board. So I like splitting Negate and Remove Soul and sticking with 2 Prohibits. Which once again is, I think, the best all-around counter in the deck. Some people, especially if you are playing the Modern Age or Cryogen Relic version, they like to play Foil, which I think is an interesting addition to the deck. Foil is 4 mana, 2 and double blue. It has an alternate cost of discarding 2 cards, 1 island and 1 whatever. And its effect is counter target spell. So we can discard 2 cards to counter a spell, like Poor Man's Force of Will, basically. Which is a card that I would consider playing in this version as well, maybe as a one-off. Because I think having this extra tempo mechanism is quite nice. Then I have Cantrips. I think Preordain is quite unanimously the best cantrip in this deck. Because, first of all, I think that because this deck is not a very good Ponder and Brainstorm decks, which are historically strongest cantrips, and it's not a very good Brainstorm or Ponder deck because it lacks shuffling mechanics. Like, it has some, but it doesn't have enough, in my opinion, or other ways to clear the top of your deck. Like, for example, the Tolarian Terror decks have Mental Note and Thought Scour. And secondly, your cards are very contextual in power. So it's very common, especially with Ponder, to look at the top 3 cards. You have 1 card that you really want and 2 stinkers. And you are now either shuffling and getting a random card, or you are keeping the card you really want, but you are having 2 bad draws next 2 turns, which isn't ideal. And sometimes it is good enough. And overall, I don't think Ponder or Brainstorm are terrible cards in this deck. And I think playing more than 4 cantrips is valid, especially if you are not splashing a color, so you don't need to play extra lands, so you have more room in the deck, so you can play more cantrips. But overall, I like Preordain the most because, once again, it's the best cantrip when you only want, when like your cards vary in power level contextually, because you just keep whatever you want on top and bottom anything else. It's also the best cantrip in multiples over a single turn, which is a fairly common situation in familiars. You just play Preordain, you Ephemerate your Archaeomancer, you Preordain again, you play Seagate Oracle, you Preordain again. Because if you really want to draw a single card, like you are digging for your win condition, either for your Flicker or you need to draw a Snap, it's very common to see like 10 or 12 cards with a single Preordain on a single turn. And you can't do with Ponder or Brainstorm, because with Ponder, if you want to shuffle, you're just drawing a random cards every single time. And with Brainstorm, you only see 1 extra card every single time. Then we have Manabase. I've already covered Chancery. I think that 3 copies is the place where I want to be right now. I think 4 copies is pretty bad. I think 2 copies might be the way to go, but I'm not that brave yet. I might be at some point. Mortuary Mire is effectively a tapped colorless land, which sounds terrible, but also I think the effect of Mortuary Mire is quite strong. Especially if you are playing in paper, there is a quite complicated loop of not decking yourself, which spans over multiple turns. Basically, you Ghostly Flicker, Mortuary Mire, and Archaeomancer every single turn once. You put a creature on the top of your deck, any creature from the graveyard on the top of your deck, then you draw, you have 8 cards, you discard to hand size, and you do that every single turn, so you draw the same creature every single turn, and you never deck yourself. I think that it might not be needed online at all, because you never really use that loop online, from my experience. And I can also see cutting Mortuary Mire completely from the deck. I don't think it's an essential part of it. And in fact, when I started playing the deck, I've cut it after playing a few games, and I didn't really miss it. But then I revisited it, and I think it's just good enough to justify its inclusion, but also it's very on the line, and I can see cutting it if you don't like it. Finally, we have Lorien Revealed, which is, I think in this version, most people play 4. In other versions, I saw people cutting Lorien Revealed. I think if your deck can support Lorien Revealed, you should play 4 copies. And if you were allowed to play more than 4 copies, you should play more than 4 copies, because this card is insane. It's such a high upside for a Tapland to have, to just be an Ancestral Recall, or a Divination, I guess, more than anything else, or Tidings, or whatever else you want to call it. Just a card advantage spell in form of a Tapland, especially in a deck that can reasonably get it down to 4 or even 3 mana. It's insane, and I think you should play 4 copies in every single deck list of Familiars. Now, we're getting to sideboard cards. And let's start with answering this question: what makes a good sideboard card? In Familiars and in general. I think, first of all, especially in Familiars, being cheap, ideally costing 1 mana after Familiar discount, is very important, because your deck is so clunky naturally. Like, your mana curve is very high, so having extra cards that are also expensive doesn't really help your case. And those sideboard cards tend to be cheaper because they are specific. They have specific role rather than being versatile. So it's much easier to have like all 1 mana cost card in the sideboard, because you just want specific cards for specific matchups. Furthermore, if the card costs 0 mana, then it at least deserves a very close look, regardless of what the card really does. And in a blue-white version of Familiars, I've been playing Gutshot, and I think Gutshot is a card that, if you expect to play against Elves and Fairies a lot, I think Gutshot is amazing in that version of the deck. And I think more people should play Gutshots in Familiars, because like having a 0 mana card that swings the tempo in this deck in those matchups is amazing. If it's not cheap, which isn't ideal, then it needs to be completely game altering. And I'm mostly talking about Stoneheart Dignitary that I already covered. A card that just completely warps the game around itself and changes the texture of the entire match by itself. Next, the card should either be versatile or extremely effective in the intended matchup. So versatility is mostly cards like Negate or Traben Charm that can cover multiple matchups, especially Negate. Extremely effective in the intended matchups is mostly Hydroblast and Pyroblast. And then finally, aligned with the game plan, which is something that sounds very ominous. I will cover it later when I get to some cards that I don't like, and why I don't think they are aligned with the game plan. Examples of the good sideboard cards, as I've said, Hydroblast, very effective in matchups that you want Hydroblast in. Negate is just a card that you can reasonably bring into against any deck in Pauper, and it will be decent. And Stoneheart Dignitary, just a completely different axis of attack. More good sideboard cards, especially I wanted to highlight removal spells, because you don't really play main deck removal other than Snap. And I think those 3 are the best choices, especially if you are playing blue-white. Gutshot I already covered. Traben Charm is just a very versatile card. Both Graveyard Hate and killing a creature comes up a lot. And even destroying enchantments against some decks is quite useful. Last Breath is the best removal spell against decks like Monolith Madness, where you want to kill Guttersnipe and you want to kill Sneaky Snacker. Some other options may include stuff like Right's End or Destroy Evil, but I think those are inferior to those 3 that are currently on the screen. Finally, we get to cards I wouldn't recommend playing in the sideboard, and 2 offenders I want to shout out, I guess, are Dust to Dust and Circle of Protection Blue. Dust to Dust is a card that some people inexplainably to me like in the deck, particularly against Affinity, but I just don't see it because it basically violates every single core rule I listed that I have for sideboard cards to be good, because it's not cheap. It costs 3 mana and it costs 2 white in a deck that getting 2 white can be problematic. It's not a versatile card. It is, the extreme effectiveness I think is disputable. It is like you will always basically get 2 things against Affinity. Against Giant, for example, it's harder because fairly often they won't have 2 artifact lands early on. And also, sometimes the damage is just done, especially if you are on the draw. By the time you cast your Dust to Dust, your opponent will already have like creature or 2 in play, and you are spending your turn 3 or 3 mana on turn 4 to just kill 2 of their lands. It's often not worth it. But most importantly, I think that it clashes with the last point I've had, which is aligning with the strategy. Because both against Affinity and against Giant, the games tend to go very long. And if the games tend to go very long, then randomly destroying 2 of your opponent's lands doesn't do much, because they will eventually draw out of that mana screw. And with the amount of draw they have in their deck and the amount of time you give them, exiling those 2 lands will be inconsequential fairly often. And of course, sometimes they do just win the game if they like mulligan and you kill their 2 only lands and the game's over. But any Dust to Dust drawn posts, like most Dust to Dust that will be drawn post like turn 6 or something, will be close to useless in my opinion. And it's also just a narrow sideboard guide. There is basically no redeeming factors of Dust to Dust in my opinion. The second one is Circle of Protection Blue, which is a tool that some people like against Terror, or at least playing against Terror, I think mostly out of sheer desperation to salvage the matchup. I just don't get this card at all. I think it has multiple problems. It ties your mana even if it resolves. It ties your mana every single turn. Especially some people are playing Murmuring Mystic in Terror. It's very bad against Murmuring Mystic. And even if they don't have Murmuring Mystic, if they just have Terrors and Serpents, at some point they can just cast Demon, then they can set up like a protected Demon Inferior, bounce it and kill you. And if it wasn't for Demon Inferior, I would be higher on Circle of Protection. But because of Demon Inferior, I just don't see this card being playable, honestly. Finally, we're getting into loops and a bit of the gameplay, which is the last part of this video, which we are due for because it's almost an hour long already. So this is the basic I win loop, which is 2 Sunscape Familiar with an Island and Archaeomancer in play, Ghostly Flicker in hand, and Mystic also in play. So the basic loop is the first 5 cards, which is Double Familiar, Island, Archaeomancer, Flicker, and then you slot either Mystic or Faithful for Infinite Life. This is Birds, this is Life, Birds, Life, Birds, Life. So the way it works is your Flicker costs only 1 mana, you target Island and Archaeomancer. With Flicker, you create a bird or gain 1 life. You target those 2 things. You get back Flicker with Archaeomancer. Your Island gets untapped because it comes back untapped. And you are in the exact same position you were before you casted it, but you have 1 extra life or 1 extra bird. And you just repeat it as many times as you want. Then we have Infinite Bounce, which is a bit more complicated. Or Infinite Bounce. You can bounce all of your opponent's creatures. The way it works is you have 2 Archaeomancers, 2 Sunscape Familiars, and 2 Islands. Or 2 blue producing lands. It can be like a dual land as well. And you have Snap and Flicker. So if you start with those 4 creatures in play and 2 untapped blue sources, you use 1 blue mana to flicker, or you can have snap in the graveyard as well. It doesn't really matter. Basically, you float 2 blue, you have 2 blue in the pool, you flicker, or you snap first, it doesn't really matter. You get back flicker and snap, or flicker and anything else if the snap is already in your hand. And with the second blue mana, you bounce your opponent creature, you untap your 2 lands. You are in the exact same position, you have flicker in hand, snap in the graveyard or in hand, depending on which one you started with, and they have 1 less creatures in play. You just repeat it as many times as you need to bounce all of their creatures. You mostly need to be careful of stuff like Eldrazi spawns and not bouncing them if you don't have extra mana, because they can sacrifice it in response to snap and you won't get to untap your lands. And if you really want to bounce them last to force them to use to sacrifice them to make you stop comboing. There is the alternative version of this loop with only 1 familiar, and that is if you have Chancery as one of your lands. If you have Island Chancery and only 1 familiar, then snap still costs 1 and it's casted off of the island, and flicker costs 2 and it's casted off of Chancery, and then you untap both of those lands with snap. So that's a pretty good usage of snap, just getting to untap those 2 lands and still making this loop with only 1 familiar. Finally, I want to talk about Archaeomancer lock a bit, which is my personal favorite way of winning the games with familiars, and its synergy with Ephemerate. So Ephemerate has rebound, which means that if it resolves, then it goes into exile rather than in the graveyard. And in your next upkeep, you can cast it from exile again, and then if it resolves, goes into graveyard as a normal spell would. So the way you take advantage of it is you Ephemerate your Archaeomancer, get whatever you need or whatever you think you will need in the future, if there is nothing pressing right now. And then in the upkeep, you rebound the Ephemerate, you target Archaeomancer, and you get back the Ephemerate you just cast from rebound with the Archaeomancer. This way you are getting 1 extra spell every single turn. And you will get 1 meaningful spell, more so than just an extra spell. And you can just sculpt your hand and be prepared for most things that your opponent can present. So if your board's presence is somewhat stable, you can just like cast the same negate or same prohibit or another interaction spell every single turn. You can even use Ephemerate on your Archaeomancer in combat after you block, so you can blank 1 creature every single turn with this. And if you have multiple Ephemerates, because of how rebound works, in your upkeep, if you have multiple Ephemerates on rebound, in your upkeep, all of those rebound triggers will go onto stack. But the spells won't go onto stack until the rebound trigger of the spell resolves. So if you have, for example, 2 Ephemerates on rebound, they will both put their rebound triggers on the stack. The first one will resolve, and it will make the spell goes on the stack. You choose your targets, probably Archaeomancer, but your second Ephemerate still isn't on the stack because the rebound trigger hasn't resolved yet. So you resolve the first Ephemerate, get back your presumably the Ephemerate itself, and then only then the second rebound trigger will resolve. And when it will resolve, then the second Ephemerate goes on the stack, and then you can target the same Archaeomancer again. So you can just target the same creature with all your rebounded Ephemerates, which is extremely useful, especially in the late game, to like get multiple spells at once, or you get all the Ephemerate back into your hand, and you can get more than 1 spell every single turn to interact with your opponent, or you can get Cantrips to dig for the actual win condition and stuff like that. It's just a very, very powerful late game engine, and with each passing turn, you can build extra layers of protections. Like, for example, if you think your opponent can have Fairy Macabre, you can keep 1 of those Ephemerates in hand to blink the Archaeomancer in response to Fairy Macabre and get whatever you need from the graveyard. Or if you think they have a removal spell, you can keep 1 negate in hand or 1 Ephemerate in hand. If you think they have a Countermagic, you can keep 1 Countermagic in hand. So as the game progresses, you will get progressively more and more immune to any sort of interaction. Eventually, they will just not be able to do anything, and you will just bury them in card advantage. Which sounds lovely, if you ask me. Okay, finally, I have some tips and tricks. This list is obviously not exhaustive, and if I decide to make a gameplay video about familiars, then I will cover more things in that. We're starting with discarding to hand size, which is something that happens in this deck way more often than in most decks I've played in Magic. It isn't the end of the world in familiars, but you should try to avoid it in tight spots. So for example, if you open a hand with like 3 lands and 4 spells, and one of the lands is Chancery, and you are on the draw, you draw for your first turn is a land, play land, go. On your second turn, you draw another land, so you have now 5 lands total, including Chancery. Like playing a Chancery on turn 2, bouncing your land and discarding one of your 5 lands in hand or 4 lands in hand to hand size isn't that big of a deal, because you already have a lot of mana to work with. Sometimes if you think that you will need all your resources to win, then it's much more important to sculpt the game in a way that will prevent you from discarding to hand size. But it's not always possible. What I already mentioned, if you're on the draw, then Chancery will make you discard to hand size if you played on turn 2. Unless you cast a spell before going to discard, and it needs to be a spell that doesn't replace itself, which is mostly cantrips. So you need to cast a God Pharaoh's Faithful, a Familiar, a Snap, something like that, and then you won't be forced to discard. Next, Muldrifter plus Ephemerate effectively put you up 2 cards in hand, and then potentially 2 more in the next upkeep. So once again, when it comes to discarding to hand size and planning around it, if you start your turn, draw a card, play a land, and your intention is to play Muldrifter plus Ephemerate on this turn, if counting this Muldrifter and Ephemerate, after you make your land drop, you have 5 or less cards in hand, you won't have to discard to hand size. But next turn, if you have 5, once again, let's say you have 5 cards, you Muldrifter Ephemerate, you draw up to 7, pass the turn, untap, rebound, Ephemerate, Muldrifter, draw a card for hand. Now you have 10 cards in hand. You play your land drop, you still have 9. So it's somewhat good to plan if you have something to do with those cards next turn, or will one of those like extra 2 cards goes to waste, which is mostly important when you are weighing whether you want to block with the Muldrifter in combat and to lose the potential 2 extra cards with Ephemerate. Like sometimes blocking with this Muldrifter and not getting extra 2 cards because you will have to discard to hand size anyway is more important than extra resources. So keep that in mind. Snap can filter your mana, which is quite meaningful in the deck that has a lot of tap lands, especially white tap lands. So like if your land is like double island and you play either like a landscape or any type of tap land that produces white, or I guess red if you are splashing as well, you can snap and get the white source untapped to play a white spell on the same turn, which is pretty obvious but also pretty nice, so I thought I mentioned it. And then Familiar is essentially free if you are planning on casting multiple expensive blue spells. So if you have like turn 6 or something, if you have Familiar and 2 Seagates in a hand or something similar, you can play Familiar and then Seagate, and Familiar already paid for itself. So always try to think whether playing this Familiar will pay off on the same turn if you are tight on mana. And that is it. Just under the hour for this video, which is a bit longer than I wanted to. Once again, I was aiming for half an hour, but I knew that it won't ever happen. So still getting under 1 hour is pretty nice. And yep, that's most things that I know, or some things that I know about familiars. I was trying to be as succinct as possible and not ramble too much. But if you have any questions, you can ask them in the comment. You can find us on Discord. Teachings has its own Discord. You can ask me on Twitter. And I'd be very excited to provide you with more familiars content if you are interested in that. So once again, if you like the video, please let me know that you liked it, so I might want to do more familiars content. And until then, have a great day and thanks for watching. Bye bye.